Great.
Yes, we're live.
Wonderful. So welcome everybody to the Winning Minds show. We are an inspirational storytelling network and a part of the Women Inspiring Network, which is a pay it forward movement, which has already gathered in the last 5 to 6 months more than 10 million views of women, viewers, listeners from all walks of life. And our whole idea and aim is to create communities and create content which can both inform as well as inspire people who tune in. As part of this, Winning Minds is a series to speak with and document the work of talented authors, women who've really found passion and purpose through their voices in different formats of writing. Whether it is the written word, the spoken word, videos, blogs, vlogs, and so on. But essentially, women who are making a difference using words, creativity, and the voice and the power of that voice. Today, I would love to welcome Sunetra Gupta. Sunetra is a novelist. Sunetra, first of all, welcome. Welcome to the show.
My pleasure.
So Sunetra, let me just give you a very quick background. She's a novelist and she's a professor of theoretical epidemiology at Oxford, where among many interesting things in the last few weeks and months, she's been at the center of the conversation around COVID-19 and the spread of the virus and the immunity factors around it and so on. And I'm sure maybe she'll touch upon some of those aspects of her life and her work as we speak. But today we are here because she's in her author hat speaking with us. As a novelist, she's written 5 works of fiction. Before that, just a little bit about her background, that she grew up in Kolkata, but has lived and worked in multiple different countries and continents. She has won awards on the science side, but she's also been shortlisted for the Crossword Award, longlisted for the Orange Prize, the Southern Arts Literature Prize, Sahitya Academy Award. She's been a winner of that, and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. And her books are Memories of Rain, The Glass Blower's Breath, Moonlight into Marzipan, A Sin of Color, and So Good in Black. And along with these novels, she also has a body of work which comprises of essays, of scientific publications and articles, and so on. So again, with that, welcome, Sunetra. And as we begin our conversation today, really excited to have you here. To start with, tell us a little bit about your journey and the journey that sort of led you onto the path of balancing both creativity and science. So what were some of your early motivations, inspirations, which actually attracted you towards creativity and writing in the first place?
Well, certainly the arts, a major inspiration for me was my father, Sunetra Gupta, who was he did all sorts of things. He was an amazing singer of Rabindra Sangit, but he also was an art film critic, a theatre critic. He wrote himself, he wrote poetry, he wrote short stories, novels. Essentially, he was an intellectual. He also taught African history at the University of Calcutta. That was his day job. But overall, he inspired me in every way possible, just from conversations at the dinner table about the arts, which were not just about the arts, but also about a way of thinking about life and politics, of course. But, the facility with which he would just move from writing an essay on pre-colonial urbanization in Africa to writing a poem, just as he felt he wanted to, and then he'd go and sing for a bit. I mean, it was quite incredible growing up with someone like that. who also, of course, introduced me to many of the intellectuals in Calcutta, including Satyajit Ray. So, I grew up in this sort of atmosphere that was very rich in culture and in the arts. But meanwhile, I'd always felt quite interested, very interested in the sciences. At first, it was more of an interest in natural history, but then, like everybody, I detested mathematics until suddenly, sort of age 14, I realized it was actually another form of poetry itself. And then I became very interested in physics and maths. So when it came to deciding what do I actually want to do, I thought it would make sense to study physics or study the sciences and try and keep up with the arts on the side, because the other option didn't seem available really. I couldn't have studied the arts and done the science on the side. So that's how I started off, and that's how it's remained.
I was hearing this really interesting talk by you, where you were talking a little bit about this, the poetry of mathematics and the poetry of equations. So tell us a little bit about that. Where do you see and how do you see poetry in mathematical formulae and models, and what connects, it to poetry?
So, one of the things that I often talk about is how there's a sort of palpable difference for me in how the relationship between the word and also the sentence and what it's referring to when it comes to the practice of the arts and the practice of science, and specifically mathematics. So in one case, the poetry arises almost from the gulf between the word and what it's referring to, or the sentence itself and the situation it's describing, that there's a lot of ambiguity, and the arts exploit that ambiguity to advance our understanding of whatever it is we're trying to deal with. But in my case, there are also, of course, there are people who practice literature in a different way, but for me, that's what I do. But in mathematics, it's almost the opposite concern. It's how much can you reduce the gap between what you are saying and what you're trying to represent. So each word or each mathematical symbol has to stand very precisely for something. And a mathematical equation has to articulate a point that, you don't want any ambiguity surrounding that. But in doing that, that creates a different kind of poetry, a poetry of economy, a poetry of something being in itself, something seeking to represent in its entirety what it's referring to. So, I think it was Spinoza who said a tiger always wants to be a tiger. So that essence of being, I think, is captured in the mathematics and the poetry of mathematics.
It's really fascinating, for me personally, because my company that I run, we took a lot of inspiration from the Gaia hypothesis and the Mandelbrot equation and the interconnectivity that it brings, and we sort of connected back to the world around us and sensors and IoT and all the work that we do. So it's really fantastic when you compare poetry and mathematics and the world around us. So I just found that absolutely delightful.
Yeah, when you speak of the Mandelbrot equation, that's another thing that actually falls out. One of the beauties of where mathematics actually does meet, for me, the practice of science and art, is in the relationship between chaos and order that is articulated in the Mandelbrot equations and all of those highly reductive constructs, which nonetheless spiral into patterns and forms that are quite complex and beautiful. So linking complexity with simplicity is something that is is part of that poetry though.
Couldn't agree more, like, and especially from a systems thinking perspective, like, we sort of try to bring it all together. But tell me a little bit, like, going back into your journey, you grew up in this really rich environment, and were you always writing? What were the first things that you wrote? And what was the journey towards the first book?
So the first, yes, I was always writing. I didn't, so in my early childhood, quite a lot of it was spent in Africa, and my very early childhood was very fortunately spent in parts of Africa where there were no schools. So I had this wonderful, until I was 6, I didn't have any formal education, which is really perfect. So I didn't know how to read or write. I knew my Bengali alphabet and I knew the English alphabet, but that was it. But then when I went to school age 6 and learned to read and write, which happened very quickly, I think that is why I'm not in favor of children going to school too early. So I think if you leave it long enough, it just comes very naturally and quickly. So as soon as I learned to write, the first thing I did was write a story. I mean, a very simple story, but I just remember the thrill that it gave me. And it's still, there's definitely a link. It's very similar. That thrill has stayed with me from the age of 6, so almost 50 years ago now. So I was writing at that point because I was in Africa. It was English. I didn't. My parents did teach me how to read and write Bengali at home, but I didn't come back. We didn't actually return to Kolkata until I was 11. So that's when I started to properly learn Bengali again. I mean, at all. So I was writing as a child does, in English, little stories for myself. And then I became, around the age of sort of 14 or 15, I decided I'd learnt Bengali sufficiently well and had been immersed in a Bengali speaking milieu sufficiently long enough to want to write in Bengali. So about that time, I started to write poems and short stories in Bengali. And some of these were science fiction stories. And I showed this, I was enormously privileged to be able to show these to Satyajit Ray, who in fact sat with me and edited them for me or gave me suggestions. It was one of the most important events of my life, I suppose. And then he recommended them to little magazines. And so I started publishing short stories in Bengali, science fiction short stories, very early on while I was still in school. Then I ended up, through a series of unusual events at Princeton University. Essentially, my father went on sabbatical to Liberia in Africa, and I kind of went with him, and from there to Princeton, to cut a long story short. And there well, for 3 years, I didn't write much at all. But in my final semester, I took a creative writing seminar with Joyce Carol Oates, and this kind of got me back into writing in English. And that's how I'd started. And one of the short stories I wrote in that creative writing class eventually became The Glassblower's Breath. So when I when I came to London to do my PhD, I was writing all alongside, thinking, I would love to publish a novel, and that was something I really wanted to do. So that's how I got into it.
It's fascinating, like, how writing is often such a long-held dream, and the fact that you had such amazing mentors, like, from Satyajit Ray to Joyce Carol Oates, like, it's just
I was very lucky.
Yeah. It's absolutely, like, wonderful. So you said that you were balancing education and, like, writing, and so going back to the first book that you published, which was not like another Glassblower's Breath, but Memories of Rain, I think was the first one that got published. When I see people, like, like, talk about your books, they talk a lot about this floating like, between magic realism and sort of the realism of everyday life, using language which is very evocative, but at the same time, like, it's very stylized, and it's literary, and like transports you into a different worlds. There's a lot of like, dreams versus like, reality. There's comparisons with authors, like, really well-known authors from around the world that like, your books seem to have drawn. So when you started writing, like, the first book, Memories of Rain, did you actually have some kind of a building block, like, or elements in mind? Okay, I need to position these elements, I need to bring them together. Um, these are my, like, inspirations from
No,
which
I,
I'm like,
no, I
how,
didn't actually. And actually I did. So there's a funny story here in that. So as I said, I started this short story in my creative writing class. Um, and it, at the time, actually one of my aunts, my father's sister, was dying of cancer. Well, we didn't know she was going to die. She died in '88. But it kind of, I think, we were worried. She did have breast cancer, and we didn't know at the time. We thought she'd survive. But so a lot of it was kind of, that was the starting point for that story. And I started to write it, and it it moved along. I didn't have any particular sort of sense of this is what I must do. I didn't have any kind of challenge in front of me. I just felt I needed to write, and this is what came to me when I sat down. Because for me, writing is a compulsion. I absolutely have to do it. So, funnily enough, when I met my literary agent, and I met him, and he said, "Okay, well, why don't you send me something?" So I went back home and I looked at this novel, which I thought was ready. And I thought, this is awful. I can't send this to him. And instead, I sent him the 30 pages I'd written of Memories of Rain. And that had been inspired. I started writing that about a month before I met Murray Pollinger. And I'd been to see a play, Medea. I'd been to see Medea in a translation, of course, by Brendan Kennelly. And I'd come back from that feeling like I wanted to write about a woman in those circumstances, like Medea, who is in a foreign land and feels very ill at ease in this situation. And she is someone with great character and who would have burgeoned but can't. When she goes to foreign land, she stops developing, and then she has to tolerate from her husband certain decisions which he put, Jason in Medea, for example, says, look, it's a good thing for me to go and marry the princess. This will be the best thing for you and our children. So, she's put in this position of extreme weakness just because she is a foreigner. Now, this was not my own experience at all, but I felt that I wanted to write about that experience. And so that's how I started to write Memories of Rain. And I'd written only 30 pages of it when I sent it to Murray Pollinger, who he and Gina, his wife, said, yes, please send us the rest. And then I had to write the rest. And there again, I did not have a particular project about how I was going to write and what would happen to the words as they were committed to the page. So my style evolved out of a set of considerations which I didn't, at least they weren't pre-programmed. I had always had a great interest and alliance with sort of surrealism and the absurdist movement. So I suppose, part of it did align with that, although not so much in Memories of Rain. I think Memories of Rain was much more about music. I must say, I wrote a lot of Memories of Rain with tapes of my father singing Rabindra Sangit. So that maybe is what actually comes out maybe in that phrase.
So that actually, like, brings me into this whole idea of displacement, right? And you mentioned that while it was not your story, you felt that it was important enough to write about this whole idea of the woman who had been displaced from her natural milieu, and she was there in a different country, a different culture, and trying to find her place in it. And it's a whole genre of books of authors around the world who are um, either living in exile or have lived in exile or have moved by choice into different countries. But there is an emotion that these books carry. So what in that emotion did you dig out? And since it was not coming from your personal narrative, um, what was around you, that inspired you to talk about displacement, especially of, this young woman from India being in the UK? What were some of those inspirations?
That's a really good question. And obviously at the time there was this sort of sense of everyone's writing about exile, exile is all. And of course I wasn't in exile. If I wanted to, I was voluntarily remaining in the UK. And at the time I didn't even feel so much that I, was resident here. I just felt I was studying and I'd go back every summer, and over Christmas if I could possibly do so, to Calcutta, and spent a lot of time, still being in Calcutta, and my parents would come visit. I didn't feel very much at that point that I was actually living in the UK as a resident. It was more just as a student. So, but I think the question of, so I've kind of resisted often this sort of label of exile, particularly because I think it's somewhat insulting to people who really are in exile. And so now, of course, I live here, but I don't feel like I'm in exile. I feel like a guest, I suppose. I feel like a foreigner, but that's fine. It's quite a good thing to be right now in this country, to be a foreigner rather than a part of the current situation. But so I think the answer to the question of why exile is really more that, let's tilt this up a bit, that exile is a metaphor. I mean, exile is something you can exploit. Exile, and we're all in exile. So in one sense, nobody is in exile. And in another sense, we are all exiled. We're exiled from our past. We're exiled from all sorts of experiences. And we suffer all kinds of injustice and imbalances of power. So I think exile is a productive means of exploring that. And, the Medea myth, I think, is a fantastic myth that takes the condition of exile and studies it, exposes it, and uses it to explore these power games, everything, the network of power that we get caught in. So I started writing it from I guess a point of sympathy in some senses, but of course it was a way of exploring various things. And in fact, in that book, one of the characters I ended up identifying with at some level was the husband, the Jason character, who was in a position of power, but that also is an uncomfortable position. When in a relationship you realize that you're in a position of power, that doesn't guarantee you happiness. It brings with it all a number of different problems and anxieties and its own sadness. So I wanted to look at it from various points of view.
That's very interesting. Now, one thing that struck me, as different in your story arcs, is that the characters actually go back to their homeland at some point of time, and multiple characters do in different books, right? And which is very different from what happens in many other books that we do read. So tell us a little bit more about this notion of living in that flux of being in between identities and in a different space, and then what drives you to go back, and what drove you to write those characters and their journeys and their narratives in such a way that they actually took the decision to go back in different books. And I can see that in The Glassbro's Breath. I can see that in Memories of Marzipan, even in, right? So
why does so much of the actual action, if you like, of my novels take place in Kolkata? I think it's because that's the place that is closest. I mean, physically, my connections to Kolkata are very, very strong. So I think that's why I feel compelled to set a large part of my writing in Kolkata, probably, or on the shores of Digha, or wherever. You know, it's probably because those places are physically ones that I'm closest to, and therefore I kind of, when I'm writing, I feel more that I can draw from the physical, because the physical, it's like part, I mean, you know, when you compose art, it's part of it. It's like painting. It's sort of why, it's a bit like saying, why do you, I mean, this may not be the right analogy, but why do you use particular colors? You know, it's a physical affinity that you feel, and then you can exploit that. So, you know, that's why I don't write a book. I don't typically write things that are set, for example, in Latin America, or, you know, there are lots of people who do that incredibly well. John Updike wrote a whole book that was set in Africa without having set foot in it. And I'm sure that's an interesting exercise and intellectual challenge. But for me, I need the book to be, I need to recruit my physical experience of a place into the book. So I've just finished a 6th novel, and quite a lot of it is naturally set in Calcutta, but some of it is set on an island in Scotland, which, you know, I've visited. There is a particular island which I was very fortunate to visit. Some friends live there. But it's not as if I spent a lot of time there, but I just feel this kind of affinity where I can use the physical landscape in a way that advances the narrative itself.
And I think a lot of Bengal finds its way into your books, right? Like, you know, from music to not just the physical setting, but the music and the poetry also finds its way.
Yes, the texture of Bengal is very central to my being. So that's why that outpouring, you know, involves that.
So when you're writing your stories, what comes to you first? Is it the story or is it the character?
So typically, no, the characters are much more dominant. So I will usually start with an idea about a person doing something, walking on a seashore, or picking up a piece of glass, or, you know, something. The starting point is usually a person doing something. So in Memories of Rain, which was written very much as I conceived it, started with this idea of a woman on a bus on Oxford Street, watching birds trying to drink water, and remembering that her grandmother said that they could only do so by lifting their beaks to rain. And so that was written very much in a linear way, just as I conceived it. In the case of A Sin of Colour, actually didn't, I wrote it, I changed things around, but it started with this idea of someone coming back to an old house in, again, Calcutta, which very much in my head is a house on Theatre Road, which my father's cousins occupied. So an old sort of villa, which now no longer exists. But so I sort of saw that in a ramshackle way. And because The Sin of Colour was based loosely around Rebecca, the Du Maurier novel. In fact, the way it started was that in '92, when Susan Hill was bringing out her sequel, they asked a bunch of authors what they would do with Rebecca as a sequel. And that's how A Sin of Colour started. So yeah, they start in different ways, but usually with an image and usually with a central person. And then the characters, I like to live with them for a while, typically. And then they start to drive the narrative very strongly, actually.
So when you say you live with them for a while, like, tell us a bit about how long does it take you to write a book? How long is it in the making in your head, and how long?
Someone once sent me a message in 2000, I think. They were roughly right. They said, look, your first novel came out in 92, then 93, then 95, then 99. And, there's this sort of doubling time there, which he was right about. So that's what's happened. But that's partly because of having children and not having the time and the emotional energy to write. So the first, Memories of Rain was written over 3-4 months, really. And it all came out in one gush. And that central character was there, but there are very few characters. There's just her, really, and the husband, really. And the rest are there, but they're all kind of fragments of, in some ways, people I've cobbled together from people I know. So they didn't really get to the point where they started to completely take over the narrative. Glass Blows Breath, as I said, I actually started to write a long time ago. So that the central voice there was established a long time ago. And I played around with that a lot. I didn't know where to position. And then there was a moment where I decided to address her in the second person. And then a lot of things came together. But still, that novel, I mean, once I returned to it and rewrote it in a completely different way, it took about 2 years to write. And then Moonlight into Marzipan also probably about similar-ish amount of time. And there the characters did start to suddenly, become very different from the people that I knew or wanted to place. They really started to evolve. And, that's how it's been with So Good in Black. I lived with those characters for a very long time, especially the central character of Baron Malik, was someone who grew and grew and became somebody a bit different to how he was originally conceived. But so there were, and this new one, which I've been writing ever since 2006, the characters have really, really, coalesced and developed in different ways. And one of the essential characters in it is a character that I've written some short stories about in my 6th book, which isn't out yet. So yeah, they become, I quite like this process of having them around for a long time.
And I think what's fascinating is that, you have a story in mind for them and an arc, and they surprise you. As you said, they coalesce, can evolve into being different from whatever you had imagined them to be. So explain that process a little bit. What happens? I mean, they're in your mind, they're partially on paper, and how does that process happen where they actually...
Yes, it's very interesting how, it all finally comes together. So essentially it's, well, as I said, it's been different for different novels, but the characters grow, and then you keep situating them in different positions, and you write bits, and then eventually it all comes together. So when I start writing a scene, I will, typically have a character, doing something with another character, possibly, who is already constructed or whom I am constructing. And so it's then partly driven by this already established character, or the others who are growing, or new characters pop up as convenient points they just suggest themselves. And then for me, the process of writing is very much about typing and watching it grow at a certain level. And then putting the whole thing together, I've often likened to, it's very similar in some ways to how you put a scientific hypothesis together, is that you have fragments, you have all these bits, and you want to connect them into a cohesive whole. And one of the ways that I describe that is with reference to something called a perspective box, which is this object that I encountered some years ago in the National Gallery. And what it is, painted in the 17th century, when they were all very obsessed with perspective. And it's a box where 5 sides are painted and one side lets in light. And if you look through that side, it looks like a cubist painting. It doesn't cohere at all in traditional sense. but then there are some holes, there are holes drilled at either end. And when you look through the hole, everything kind of comes together and you see this beautiful Dutch, well-proportioned interior. And that's a bit how I think the actual act of constructing a narrative falls, to me, there are affinities between what happens in my head and that particular process.
And that's fascinating. Like, a lot of authors do actually have a process, right? Like, they have a plan. What is your process? Is it amorphous and it sort of, like, as you said, coheres at some point of time? Or do you actually have a plan that, okay, this is how the story will evolve? Yes, it may, surprise you, but do you start out with a plan in mind and do you sort of try to follow that plan?
No, I don't. I really don't. I sometimes, the like something. I mean, there are moments. So in writing The Glass Blower's Breath, I was just sort of muddling along with these characters, doing this and that, and then at a particular point, sort of halfway through, it did actually the ending suggested itself to me. It just became, it kind of revealed itself. And from that point on, I wrote to that ending. So it's as if it sort of organized itself. Memories of Rain, I always had this idea that it would just be a weekend and a short period of time over which she would roughly do this, and that's what happened. But with the others, I've had to do a lot of juggling, subsequent to establishing certain characters and having written bits of it, then, you sort of start to piece it all together into a whole, as I just described. So overall, no, I have never started with a plot. The difference.
So, let's stay on the character for a minute. And you have in your books very strong female protagonists. And there's a lot that happens with them, right? Like, there is, they start out with a certain amount of hope in life. They face some kind of sadness and betrayal. And they are always, like, trying to strike out, find themselves in some way. So there is a growth or a movement that happens with your characters. And how much of that, like, really evolves or, like, is informed by your personal perspectives on how women should define their role in society, or what you see, like, holds some women back?
Well, I suppose, I mean, again, it's book by book. So, I mean, but some of the problems that I tend to, that play out through women, although, two of my first person characters have been men. So so it's not always the case. I think one of the things I always say, which surprises people, is that the milieu in which I grew up in Kolkata was really quite gender neutral. So, and my father, I cannot imagine him ever thinking of a woman as being, inferior or in any way, anything other than, completely his equal, as did most of his friends and generally, I think of my aunts who were incredible, who, not some of them were very distinguished. One of them ran a cancer, still does, is active in Cancer Research Institute, and yet, others stayed at home, but that didn't matter. There wasn't this sense of you were defined by your profession, so you were defined by your personality and what you contribute to, life and people around you, and so I was always surrounded by these very, very strong women who were full of, they were vibrant, full of laughter. They had the most extraordinary ironic take on life. So there's that. And then, of course, the condition of women in our country is, of course, appalling, as it is pretty much everywhere. But I didn't realize, I actually didn't encounter the kind of sexism that one deals with in many settings in the West until I came to the West. It was when I went to Princeton University and I suddenly realized there were some of the fellow students were actually just sort of, they weren't taking me seriously because I was a woman, or their main interest in me didn't have to do with what I was contributing intellectually. So all of that was kind of surprising to me. And but it's not been having the politics of it hasn't been something that's been foremost in my head. I think the human condition is what I'm mainly interested in, and the way that women have to negotiate, again, the imbalances in power, in the trajectories that their lives often take, and yeah, I mean, the relationship between men and women and women and women. I mean, all of that, I do think are, they echo the human condition, but often they echo it in a very particular way in which a woman experiences it. But I also do think largely that it is that that men also have a very difficult time. And I haven't particularly ever felt that I wanted to write about problems that women face, even though Memories of Rain was a situation where what happened to the woman was something that was unique. That was very much wrapped up in her being a woman.
And also perhaps like, in your Marzipan, right? Like, that also had
yes,
a little bit more of
she definitely has a very, that being a woman is a very poignant position, and being powerless. I mean, it's the being exploited and being powerless, or not even being exploited, but sometimes you're powerless, as in Moonlight and Marzipan. One of the central characters was made powerless by just the way that human emotions work, by watching her husband fall in love with someone else. So she was made powerless by that event, and yet they were both made powerless by that event, because that is an event that does take power away from you.
It's one of those life-changing kind of moments where things turn. But tell me a little bit about your writing style, because it's very unique. The way you're crafting your sentences, they're very long, and there is phrases upon phrases upon phrases. And we spoke a little bit about the Mandelbrot equation, and it's a little bit about the convergences, right? The convergences don't come you keep running the equation and then suddenly boom, it's sort of there is convergence and there is a beautiful image that emerges. So your sentences actually remind me of they are it's like a tapestry, and it's like a multi-stranded sentence. Every sentence ends up being.
Yes, I'd love to think my sentences were fractal, so to speak. but I think you've hit at a very sort of core element there, which is how to balance abandon and decorum, as Lyndall Gordon very nicely put it. How to balance chaos and order, because I'm on a podcast. How to balance chaos and order, I think, is what at some level informs the whole process, because it's I want to write in a way you kind of want it to come out, you want it to gush out, and in a way that's what happened with memories of rain. It really just gushed out. But you need to also keep it contained. It's in that sort of region where you have containment of your gushing or whatever it is. You want it to be, you want, again, to tread that very, very narrow and tricky boundary between giving up control and retaining control. But I've often also described my, and this is something I've understood later when examining my own sentences, I realized that my response to punctuation, for example, is quite visceral. So I've spoken about this before, but so, I mean, I don't like using semicolons when I'm writing. Yet I love the way Virginia Woolf uses semicolons liberally as a device. I like using em dashes a lot, which Emily Dickinson did to very good effect. So, I mean, that I think that a lot of the way I write is, a lot of the actual construction sentences is kind of an emotional, the logic behind it is visceral rather than some kind of structured, some cerebral kind of, okay, this is how I'm going to do it. But at the same time, that visceral response has to be constrained. So that's why I think the fractal, I mean, I'm very pleased and honored to have my work described the way you do it, to that particular process. Because yes, that's what, that would be the ideal, is to get to that point where you have this fractal, this patterning that is complex, but it's a pattern. It's not an arbitrary disorder. There's another quote I use from Aldo Rossi, who's an architect, Italian architect, and he talks about avoiding arbitrary disorder. So you want some level of disorder, but it can't be arbitrary.
It's fantastic. So I was seeing through some of your articles, which are in the scientific strain, and obviously the language is very different there, right? That's the language of explanation. That's the language of logic. And then, you're saying that when you're writing your novels, it's visceral and it's emotional. So do you personally go into a different space, in your mind when you write fiction? And how do you actually get into that space? What's that process of getting into that novel writing space in your head?
I don't really have a separate space, I don't think. I mean, obviously it might sound disingenuous because it is so different. And as I said, when I'm writing a scientific paper, the considerations are so different. There I'm trying to keep it tight and structured and everything that I do want it to be completely logical, completely accessible. I mean, I think I want my writing to be accessible, but not at the level of being, simple and easy to follow. I want it to be accessible in the sense of people being able to use it to get to use it to achieve their own ends of their own understandings of what I've written. But when it comes to science, I want it to be completely spelt out. But in both cases, there is this need to create something, to create a coherent narrative and to arrive at some kind of understanding of the system that I'm looking at. So I don't have to really switch, say, okay, now I'm going to write in a scientific mode. No, it's not a switch that flicks. It's just like a different language. It's a bit like, again, if you think of the analogy of painting or drawing, it's like taking up a different type of pen. You say, oh, okay, this has to be pen and ink. This is going to be a lot of watercolor, or this is going to be oil, or this is going to be acrylic. It's more like that for me.
You talked about conveying something when you're doing scientific writing, and that's very interesting because a lot of the times students who are in the scientific fields think that they don't need to write as long as they understand maybe like the mathematics or the logic behind things. They don't need to write. But at the same time, when I was listening to the director of the NIH in the US, and he was talking about how a lot of what happens in science is about, you need to convey what you're doing to people. You need to build awareness. You need to get advocates. You need to get funding. All of that requires an ability to tell a story and tell it well, right? So what's your thought on the need for storytelling in science?
Yeah, the type of storytelling you do in science is typically, it follows a linear narrative. I mean, now it's increasingly less and less left to the imagination or the will of the individual. I mean, if you read a scientific paper from the 50s or the 60s, it's often very personal, very colorful, written beautifully. And now there's just a sort of formula. So it's become very formulaic how you do everything in terms of laying out your story, which is unfortunate because, of course, that limits the imagination and limits creativity, limits the ability to understand a system. And there are many crises that have arisen from that, including the most recent, the one that we're sitting in, which is the coronavirus crisis, which a narrative was established right from the start about what had happened or what was happening. And we've seen scientists failing to budge from that narrative, just won't budge from it. I mean, obviously they may be right, but the point is that you need to be able to budge from the narrative. And that's not happened. And the other thing that's not happened is an understanding of the entire problem, that it's not just the science. There is, as I say, there's the logos, but there's also the pathos and the ethos within here, which is just being ignored by those who are focused on stopping the number of cases, for example. They're not considering, or haven't been until recently, what should have been taken into account right at the start. The measures taken to do that could have significant consequences. So those sorts of lacunae develop from adhering to a very strict and simple prescribed narrative. And the sciences have fallen, the scientists by and large seem to fall into those traps because they don't have a proper education in the humanities. I think an education in the humanities is actually essential. I'm not saying it has to be acquired in college itself, but not reading more broadly and not educating yourself to the level that we were certainly expected to do, whether we're scientists or artists or homemakers or whatever, that I think is very important and an essential part of citizenship.
Couldn't agree more that there are multiple perspectives and we need to think through all of them, and especially when we are in those positions of power to make decisions sway a particular way or the other. And that also has a whole role of marketing an idea, but getting back into the writing domain of marketing and marketing books, and it's a process and an accepted process that today writers have to do. But what is your take on it, and how do you what's your take on it?
I don't think that the market, as it has been defined or redefined for literary fiction, is the right kind of market. So I think that when I entered the marketplace, it was more of a temple, I'd like to say, in the 90s. So it was a sustainable model. It wasn't as if, it wasn't a charity. Grove Press were not a charity, nor were Orion Books, but they had a sustainable model whereby, the kind of fiction that I write was not expected to sell in any particular way. But, you know, the consumer for that kind of fiction was identified. We knew the limits of that, and the production occurred, and everything, all the remuneration, everything occurred in a commensurate way. So that I was comfortable with. But what happened in about 20 years ago is that somebody decided that wasn't the right model. And so I think that, and this, I'm not saying this from the point of view of someone who doesn't respect that kind of model. For example, one of the other things I'm doing at the moment is developing a new type of flu vaccine. And so that we've licensed our technology to a company in the US, and they're going to develop it. So obviously for that, a whole different model applies. The model that applies there is very different, where I am going to present what I'm doing in a very clear pathway. There is a clear sense of what kind of pathway that should take in order to make it possible. I mean, even there, I'm a little bit concerned about the profit motive, just because I think public health should be outside of that. But so I think markets for literary fiction should be sustainable, not driven by profit. I mean, in as much as profit is part of the sustainability, that's fine. But I don't think they should be driven by this idea of let's have one big book which makes a huge amount of money. Let's then talk up the author to be someone, a commodity. You know, this sort of commodification of both the author and the product just creates, I think, a situation that doesn't, for me, is not conducive to writing further good fiction.
It's like the venture capital model that has come into fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm very mindful that you said that you had a hard stop.
I do, unfortunately.
Just like, one last question then, and I know we didn't touch too much upon, you alluded to the fact that you have children, you have a very, you have a flourishing career in the sciences, and you have a literary career. So how do you balance it all? And specifically, if you were to give advice to young women who want to balance multiple things, our listeners today who are young women from different walks of life, what would your advice be to them, both from balancing their goals and wishes and vision for their own life, and from a writing and a perspective?
Well, I think that's a really important question, and I've had to think about that very carefully, because there are people who've said to me, why do you do both things? Wouldn't you be better off doing just one thing and doing it well? And, that's a serious question. It's, asked by well-wishers. They're not people who are trying to put me down. And then I realized that question actually ties in with exactly that which you asked about children and, everything that I wanted to be. I mean, I think most of all, what I wanted to be or have become, the most important part of my life is my children. So being a mother is the most important thing in my life. And then there are all these other things. So the question was, wouldn't I have been a better mother if I'd just done nothing other? Maybe. Wouldn't I have done, certainly my literary career, I don't know about my scientific career, but my literary career suffered quite a lot from having to stay, not being able to go out and promote myself and all of that, or stay networked. But then the answer to that question, and in the answer to every question that anyone might be asking about how to juggle anything, is that we don't do any of this in order to do it well. That's not our objective. We do these things because we feel we have to. We do them to the best of our abilities, but it's better to do everything that you feel you ought to do slightly less well. It's better to endure that. And I think that this monolithic kind of idea that you have to do one thing well, again, is something that the market would like you to do, but it's not what, as an individual, you want to be doing. So I think that my last word to everyone would be to pursue everything, all your dreams, in a realistic way. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to start playing the violin professionally tomorrow. Not that I could if I tried, but I'm not even going to do that, try that. But so within realistic boundaries, and maybe slightly outside of them, I think you should try and do everything that you wish to do, that you desire, you dream of doing, and fulfill all your obligations, of course, to those people around you, as best you possibly can. That's all we can do.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's lovely to talk to you. I'm sorry I have to go now.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.